Hi, I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects, and today we're going to do a retrospective on 2020 and my favorite pieces of pedalboard related gear. Let's get into it. 2020 has brought us some great gear, and I really want to focus today not so much on the pedals. I think there's lots of people that are in a better position than me to do that are not manufacturers and don't have their own biases against different companies or for other companies. I really want to focus on the things that I'm noticing and that I'm seeing and that I really appreciate as somebody who's building rigs and also giving a lot of tips to DIYers like you about the best practices, the best pieces of gear. So I want to do a little roundup of some of the things that I really like and that I think are most representative of the best manufacturers out there with products that came out over the last year or so. The first product, although technically it didn't come out in 2020, but I think really got its legs in 2020, is none other than the RJM PBC 6X. The PBC 6X is one of my absolute favorite smaller size switchers. The software that RJM has come up with to control this is absolutely incredible. The things that it does are amazing. It sounds great, it looks great, and really gives anybody who's interested in getting into MIDI every possible option that they could ever imagine. And not only does it do 6 loops great, you can actually expand this with the stereo loops to get up to 11 different devices controlled by this one powerhouse of a pedal switcher. Those of you who have been following this channel know that also I'm good friends with Ron and Sherry from RJM. We even have a cool video where we talked about some of the impetus of products like these from RJM, so I highly recommend that you check that out. If you're interested in learning more about their company, I call them the farm-to-table pedalboard switcher company because everything that they do is done within a short radius from where they're located down in Southern California. And they really are a family business with the majority of their employees either being husband and wife with Ron and Sherry themselves or their daughters and their children. They do a great job at making these switchers, and I highly recommend that you check out the RJM PBC 6X. It's my top choice for switchers that really kind of came to fruition in 2020. The next piece of gear for 2020 that I think absolutely is almost incomparable amongst any other brands in the industry goes to one of my favorite power supply manufacturers in Cioks. Cioks released their first grouping of switch mode power supplies with the DC7, the Cioks 8, the Cioks 4. They allow you to expand upon them off of one of the primary units in the Cioks DC7, like I'm holding here, and you can expand these to your heart's content, and it even gives you a reading so you know how much of the milliamp maximum that you're using of each one of the supplies. This is one of the best made switch mode power supplies that is out there, and so I'm very excited that these are around and available, and I love using them. I even have used this on my personal pedal board. They're dead quiet, bulletproof, reliable, just wonderful power supplies all around. I definitely think that if you're considering a switch mode power supply, the Cioks are the way to go, one of the best ones out there, and absolutely bulletproof. And look at that, just so low profile, can't beat it. Cioks power supplies, definitely one of my favorite pieces of gear for 2020. The next product is one of, I think, the most underrated products that is out there. And I think a good argument could be made that maybe it didn't come out in 2020, but I think certainly as we were educating people more and educating ourselves on products that were out there to address problems around effects loops, this certainly has really taken off in the marketplace. And I know that they've been sold out in multiple places when we've done videos that have touched on this particular product. It is none other than the Cliniulator. What the Cliniulator does is it takes a passive effects loop and turns it into an active one. So in essence, it makes a passive effects loop into a buffered effects loop. And as you know, if you've watched any of our videos, passive effects loops can be absolutely detrimental to the tone of the amplifier and can have a catastrophic consequence by any amount of cable capacitance that is seen in that loop from send to return. What this does is turn that into an active effects loop, gives you a volume control for the send so you can adjust how much level's going into your first pedal, and a return level so you can make up any of that gain on the output, a recovery control, and a couple of different EQ switches for the brightness of the signal. This is an absolute godsend for anybody that wants to have a transparent effects loop. This is in essence building a dumbelator into a solid state version that is compact and can easily fit on the back of your amplifier and takes 9 volts DC right on the input. This is an absolute must-have for anybody who's unhappy with their effects loop or wants to turn their passive effects loop into an active buffered effects loop. That's the Cliniulator, one of my top picks for 2020. Next up, in 2020, one of the biggest trends that I've seen as somebody who's a practitioner of building pedal boards is the idea of a wet, dry, or wet, dry, wet rig. Now, there is a lot of misunderstanding about this, and we've done several videos to tackle this topic and really let you know what the appropriate ways are to do wet, dry, wet, and what the do's and don'ts are, even though there is a lot of alternative information out there on YouTube and other places that don't exactly spell it out as it's intended. This product that I'm going to talk about next is the absolute best solution that I've found that's pedalboard based that will allow you to do a true wet, dry, wet, and acts as a true parallel mixer that can deal with your stereo pedals and allow you to run your effects 100% wet and then have individual mix knobs in addition to being able to blend in your dry signal if you desire it. That's none other than the Musicom Lab Parallelizer. This again has 3 loops where you can put in 3 stereo devices or mono devices, and you have a dry signal that you can blend in, or you can run these 100% wet and then you can mix them to your heart's content. This is what true wet, dry, wet looks like if you're going to be using multiple effects set to 100% wet. This becomes your mix bus. You can blend these in. This is what's going to allow you to actually maintain that parallel signal path. And again, if you want to blend in dry with the wet, you have the ability to do that. Or if you want to have it 100% wet, you can keep it as such and not use any of the dry if you don't choose to do it. This is the best absolute pedalboard solution I've found. It also has MIDI so that you can connect this with either another switcher or externally with another MIDI controller so that you can use this as needed and bring in those effects as you need them, recalling those through MIDI. An absolute great product for wet, dry, wet, and one of my favorites of 2020. Next, in keeping with the idea of wet, dry, wet, one of my favorite things to do when I'm running it is to actually only have the dry amp be an actual amplifier itself. Because the terms of wet, dry, wet really only dictate that the dry amplifier speaker cabinet be the one that's really getting the tonal quality of your overdrive and distortion effects, and the wet effects are to remain somewhat linear. And even in true wet, dry, wet situations, a lot of times in the 80s they would be running effects through powered monitors or very linear stereo power amps. One of my favorite ways to simulate that without actually having to have extra amplifiers on stage is to use a cab simulator and a speaker simulator. And one of my favorites to do wet, dry, wet is none other than the GFI Stereo Cab Zeus. The GFI Stereo Cab Zeus allows me not only to run in stereo if I choose to without using the Cab Zeus at all, because it has its parallel inputs, so I can just go right out of them and actually go to a physical stereo power amp if I wanted to, or go into the inputs of other amp returns if I wanted to catch the power amp there, or I can use the XLR outputs on the back of it and I can go directly into my software, my DAW, into my interface, and I can have my stereo wet effects coming through there at 100% wet. I could be feeding out of my Musicom Lab Parallelizer in stereo into the inputs of this, and then run these out to the front of the house into my mixer, and I have a left and right channel. I can adjust what speakers I want to go to something that's more linear or something that's more colorful. I can adjust the mic position. I really love this unit because, again, it's giving me my power amp, it's giving me my cabinet simulation, and I can keep it very linear, and I can have my amp for dry out on stage, but have everything else going through this for the wet effects. This is a very simple and easy way to get wet, dry, wet, and only have to have your dry amplifier on stage, and no need for external cabinets for the wet, or no need for powered monitors or wedges for the wet. This allows you to do it all in one box for the wet and just have it coming through your in-ears or whatever monitors you're doing your self-monitoring on. This is a great product for that and one of my favorite for 2020. Next up is my favorite reactive load box and speaker load and IR loader. It's none other than the Suhr Reactive Load IR. The Suhr Reactive Load IR is one of the only IR load boxes that I know of that actually emulates the true curve of a speaker. Not only does it sound wonderful with the preloaded IRs that it gives of a lot of the common Suhr cabinets, which I actually think pretty well align with most of the common speaker cabinets that you'd find out in the marketplace, it also just guarantees that you're going to have a safe load on your amplifier that again is going to resemble what your amplifier is used to seeing with a normal speaker connected to it. I can't say the same for a lot of the other IR reactive load boxes that are out there or purport to be reactive load boxes when they're really sort of a hybrid of a resistive load. I use this thing almost every day. I think it sounds great, is very representative and close to the same mic'd cabinet that I might be emulating through this. And you also have the ability to load in your own IRs if you don't want to use any of the preloaded ones, or you can mix and match them. I just recommend that you save the original IRs that are on this thing when you get it stock, so you could always bring them back in if you need to. An absolute godsend, and I use this thing every day in my office. Also in keeping with the wet, dry, wet concept, I have one device, and I know I said I wasn't going to talk about other brands' pedals, but this is one pedal that I feel like is more than just a pedal. It's also a great tool that's really unique in what it does in terms of being able to use it for wet, dry, wet. It's none other than the Source Audio Collider. I think of this as the ultimate wet, dry, wet pedal in a box. The reason why is it has two effects, reverb and delay, and you can control those separately. But the cool thing about it, which makes it ideal for wet, dry, wet, is that it has its own internal mixer so that you can actually put these two effects in parallel, in kill dry, and it also has an analog dry path. So it sort of meets all the criteria that you would want for an effect that would be being run in parallel because it has its own parallel mixer, because it has reverb and delay in one. This is a great effect to be using for a wet, dry, wet rig if you just want to have simply your delay and reverb in parallel, which is typically the way that I like to do it. Maybe some of us might want to run some detune in there or have a reverb in a different parallel loop than the delay, but for all intents and purposes, for most of us, this would be a great product to do it with. I love using this for wet, dry, wet rigs. I'll run this into my Cab Zeus in stereo and then run that out to the front of house and have just my line out box feeding the input of this, running the reverb and delay in parallel, 100% wet. I can get some absolutely magical tones out of this. And so I think it's more than just a great delay and reverb, it's also a great tone tool if you're planning to use wet, dry, wet, and you want to do it with the fewest components possible. You don't need a parallel mixer like the Parallelizer. You could literally just use this, feed it into the Cab Zeus in stereo, go XLR out to your interface box or your front of house or your mixer, and you literally have a compact way to do your stereo wet effects. And then of course you still have your dry amplifier feeding with all of the dry effects. Next, we are going to talk about one of my products that released in 2020. It is none other than our Vertex branded pedalboards. Our pedalboards have been a labor of love that we have developed over a couple of years. It all started really back with Rhett Shull when we had the Strymon bridge on his rig, where it allowed us to stack pedals on top of a riser where cables could enter from underneath and kind of maximize the amount of space per square inch on his pedalboard. And so we've come up with a streamlined version that's now available to the public where you're able to hinge up and down a riser, have different effects and pedals on the board, be able to bury your power supply, any buffering or interfacing or additional pedals underneath this riser, be able to use switchers effectively and utilizing the most amount of space. I've built many rigs using this, including my own personal rig, and I can tell you that this is the most optimal way that I've found to be able to build a board that not only is in keeping with the best standards and practices for building rigs, but also is just the most compact that you're going to be able to get any number of pedals in the smallest amount of space. They have a lifetime warranty, all made domestically right here in California. I highly recommend, if you haven't already, you check out one of the Vertex pedalboards. Last but not least, I know I talked about the GFI Stereo Cab Zeus and how much I love that to do wet, dry, wet. I don't love it as much though if I'm using it to actually do a cabinet or an amp simulation. With the release of our Steel String Supreme this year, I really got to learn about the different sounds that a lot of these different cab simulators create. And although I think the GFI is very good, I prefer it using it in a wet, dry, wet system where I need a more linear sound for the wet that I don't want to be colored by the sound of tubes or a lot of speaker coloration. If I want that and I want to use something like my Steel String Supreme, which is actually designed to be able to go direct, I like using the cab simulations out of the Cab M from 2Notes. Cab M is my favorite compact speaker emulator. You can load in your own IRs or use any of the library of IRs that are already done inside of the 2Notes software, that some of which are available from you for free. I also have some of my personal cabs, which I will link below, that you can download and input into the Cab M if you so choose. I think this is the absolute best sounding one, not only with our pedals, but with any of those amp in the box type pedals that allow you an option to run either a DI or allow you to run into a speaker cabinet simulation. This is my absolute favorite one, is the most tweakable, sounds absolutely amazing, and even if you just wanted to use the amp components of this alone, because you do have the option to also use their preamp emulation, their power amp emulation, in addition to their cabinet emulation if you wanted, this as a standalone amplifier is my absolute favorite, and I think was definitely a big feat from 2Notes. And I really love this thing. I can't get enough of it. And I almost don't even notice sometimes that my Steel String Supreme is running direct when I'm using the cab stimulation from this. It sounds so good. That was my wrap up of my favorite products of 2020. Now I know that some of these products maybe existed a little bit before 2020, but I'm really thinking about it not only in terms of products that were actually released this year, but stuff that really kind of got its momentum this year and really kind of came to be a part of the Pedalboard dialogue or the Pedalboard lexicon for this year. So I hope you appreciated this sort of retrospective on 2020, some of my favorite products, and hopefully introduced you to a few new things that you weren't aware of, or applications of maybe things that you weren't aware of, or applications of things that you were aware of, but maybe just didn't know that that was a way to use it. If you did enjoy this, I highly recommend you do the stuff. You like, you subscribe, you leave us a comment. If you subscribe, that just keeps you up to date with all the latest and greatest stuff that we're doing here on the channel, recommendations, best practices for DIYers just like you. I highly recommend you do that. Until next time, I'm Marangella, the Rig Doctor. See you later.